Hey, it's Midnight Book Reports. In this video, I wanted to give a reading update, the third reading update for War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. I read book 2, chapters 1 through 6, and that took me about 2 hours and 15 minutes. It was a long read. There's a few things I want to talk about in this particular section that stood out to me, and the first being that scene with the priest and the man in the house, and that was very intense. That was very long. It was a long scene between the two of them, and of course eventually the priest dies. He gets knocked out by the man, and then the Martian grabs him and pulls him out. But it's just an amazing sort of short story between a priest and a man fighting for survival, and they're running out of food, they're getting on each other's nerves. Ultimately, the priest wants to go out and he wants to sort of give up, basically wants to just give up their position, and the only thing the man can do to prevent both of them from being caught is to knock the man out, which of course makes enough noise where then the Martian will investigates the house where they're hiding, and he takes them away. But what I really like about this sort of whole story was that it takes place, if you can imagine this idea of space within a story, and for me, that was what I thought the author did really well. They're viewing the Martians, because the Martians crashed next to them, in the house next to them. There's a huge cylinder. And they're watching the Martians basically unpack and sort of build and put things together to sort of create a little home base. And they're watching all of this through this little hole in the wall, or like this little slit in the wall. And I love that. I love how the narrator or the main character, his perspective is very limited, and I think it makes it very much focused. You know, if the main character was just sort of sitting there and watching this whole big thing, there's a lot of other things going on, but because the perspective of the main character, the narrator, is so limited, it's almost like a telescope, you know, or binoculars, where it's zoomed in on exactly what's going on the aliens, on their machines, on, I guess, sort of him trying to understand what they're doing, you know, with constructing that cylinder, the people being sort of tossed in there. And I really like that about this part, where the author uses limited space to sort of, I guess, raise the stakes or focus us as the reader into what's going on in the story. This part of the story also gets very technical in nature, which I wasn't really a huge fan of. To be honest, I glossed over a lot of the machinery part where they're trying to describe the machines and what they're doing. It became very confusing because I'm trying to imagine this cylinder that looks like a milk can, and then there's all these tentacles and there's all this other stuff that's going on, you know, and on top of that, I'm thinking about the war machines, and then we got the builder machines, and then we got this pit, and things are partially blocked, and so it was very difficult for me to kind of understand what was going on. But this is very technical. It gets very mechanical, and I think the author spends a lot of time talking about this idea of the wheel. And the idea that man uses the wheel or sort of some sort of rotation in a lot of the inventions. But the author notes that in nature and in the Martian, I guess, culture, the Martian way of life, they don't have the idea of a wheel. The way that they connect things is very much sort of sliding into place and I guess twisting, or more like the friction created when you're sliding things into place, which is very different from sort of, I guess, sort of how humans sort of interact. And I was just thinking about that. You know, I was thinking about that image of the wheel versus, you know, something coming together and staying in place. And I guess for me, in that moment, I was thinking about how for humans the wheel is very important. You know, having that circular sort of shape where things are balanced out, where things are sort of all pushing in to sort of create this shape. You know, it's not an oval. Things are somewhat equal, and it just, to me, it represents harmony. But then you get something like what the Martians are sort of coming from, where things don't stick together with the wheel. there's no focal point or pivot point that is like the center of a wheel. Everything slides together, and I guess that demonstrates sort of how when they're taking over planets or very mechanical, I guess, that it doesn't necessarily work in harmony. It just sort of slides in and takes over, and it's just a very different and contrasting way of life, which I thought was, again, it was very technical, but in thinking about that, it's I think worth noting the idea of the wheel versus sort of sliding into place. You know, you have something that moves very smooth, or something that is sort of brought together by friction and sort of held together with these sort of puzzle shape locking mechanism. It doesn't work as nice. So I felt like this section had a lot of that technical part, but at least to me that part stood out, although the rest of it to me was not that interesting. I also want to note that in this section, the narrator talks about the red weed, which is the plant that the Martians sort of accidentally brought to Earth, and it's spreading like crazy. But the thing is, as the narrator sort of is escaping and he notices the red weed everywhere, he comes across, I guess, I don't know if he figured it out there or it might have been in post. I think it might have been in post when humanity sort of looked back on the attack. But he noticed that the red weed was dying, and it was because of the bacteria that the terrestrial plants, or the plants on Earth, they've built up a resistance to the bacteria in the air and I guess water. And so that's how they survive. They can fight against that bacteria, but that these red weed, because they had no bacteria, they weren't able to fight that. They basically probably died very quickly. And of course, knowing how the story ends, it's a very, very big foreshadow to how the aliens get defeated. Because at this point, if you didn't know the outcome of the story, you would think, okay, they're going to have some kind of big bomb. They're going to have to do some kind of attack on the mothership, or they're just going to be enslaved by the entire world, or by the Martians, and the whole world will just be enslaved. But it's hard to imagine that someone would actually think on a bacteria level, on a very, very small scale, that was enough to defeat these overpowered Martians. And sort of the last thing I want to talk about that stood out to me in this section of the book was the realization of my lack of geographical knowledge of this part of the world. So I'm in the United States, and I know almost nothing about the geography of England, Great Britain, and it's frustrating because the author uses a lot of references to these different towns. You know, I had to look up on the map where Woking was in comparison to London. They're pretty close, I guess. But there's all these different other towns that I have no idea where they are, what they are known for, and it's hard. I feel very disconnected when I'm reading this. You know, even where the wife is in Leatherhead, I have no idea how far that is. And it's not to say that every story needs to have a familiar setting that you absolutely know, because you talk about things like science fiction, even modern fiction. If you're not familiar with that city, the story can still work because the author sort of paints a general, I guess, map for you. But I feel like in this story, space, geographic space, sort of the landscape, topography, I feel like that is very important, you know, to this story, because it helps, I think, understand the urgency, the spread of these aliens from one area moving towards London, moving towards the coast. And it's sad that my lack of geography or geographical knowledge of this area really holds me back, I feel, in understanding this story. And so those are some of the things that I wanted to sort of just highlight in this part. I'm looking forward to basically the rest of this book. Probably my next reading will finish off this book, and that will be the end of this book. I'll start to work on the summary video, but it was a very different type of read now that we shifted back to the main character, the man that we're following in this narrative. It becomes a story about survival. It becomes a story about I guess you could say science, engineering, and it shifts into it makes it a lot more personal. This encounter a lot more personal, and we become a lot more focused on what exactly these aliens are doing. So those are my thoughts on the sort of, I guess, third part of War of the Worlds. I don't know, it's not really divided up equally, but this is sort of my thoughts on that section of the book. I am enjoying it. I'm glad that I'm going to be able to finish it in my next reading session, probably maybe in an hour or two, and that should be done with the rest of this book. So thanks for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Bye.